Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on a journey into the evocative subject of walled gardens, those atmospheric and slightly magical places that are heavenly to wander through on a warm summer afternoon. This talk will cover a little bit of the history of the walled garden and its literary associations, as well as describing some walled gardens that you can visit for yourself in the UK. Like my previous video on follies, this talk will be slightly shorter than usual because it's another one that I've adapted from an article I wrote for a magazine many years ago when I was a journalist. However, as I'm going to be away for the next few weeks, and I didn't want to leave you without any video at all, I decided to create this shorter track in advance, and in spite of its curtailed length, I hope that you enjoy it. As usual, there'll be a slideshow of images to accompany our subject, but there's no need for you to look at them if you don't want to. If you prefer, you can just relax, close your eyes, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to the enchanted world of walled gardens. Think of a conventional English garden, and the image that will probably spring to mind will be of clipped green lawns, neat hedges, and sunny herbaceous borders full of flowers. It's a sight that's prized by many gardeners, and admired both for its loveliness and its tidy tradition. However, if you imagine that same garden surrounded by high walls, it immediately takes on a different aspect. It becomes a hidden kingdom, a place for secrecy, solitude, and reflection. The attraction of a garden that is cut off from the rest of the world has proved irresistible to generations of gardeners and garden visitors alike. The sight of wisteria, honeysuckle, or clematis growing up against an old stone wall is so beautiful. The scent of roses is so intensified by being enclosed, and the feeling of being cut off from the busyness of the rest of the world makes the self-contained nature of a walled garden even more delightful. There's also an element of mystery. What sights will be revealed once we open the door or push through the gate and find our way into this hidden world? We might discover clipped topiary bushes, marble statues, fountains, an old orchard, or a bed of blossoming roses. No one knows until they have entered, which, of course, makes the prospect of entering seem even more enticing. A walled garden is the ultimate example of the beauty that can occur when the artifice of formal garden design is combined with the abundance of nature, because the moment a piece of ordinary green land is enclosed by a wall, it becomes mysterious, romantic, and above all, secret. Walled gardens have been with us for centuries, and there are many references to them in medieval literature. The French 13th century writer, Guillaume de Lory, used the walled garden as a setting in his poem, The Romance of the Rose, where it becomes a place dedicated to the goddess Venus and a symbol of courtly love. This courtly love concept was based on the idea of love as a chaste, chivalric ideal that was meant to nourish the soul and improve the heart and mind. And the idea became very popular, in theory at least, during the 14th and 15th centuries. The English poet Chaucer, who made his own translation of the Romance of the Rose, adopted the walled garden theme for many of his own works, including the Parliament of Fowls, the Legend of Good Women, and several of his stories that make up the Canterbury Tales. However, in Chaucer's work, the walled garden often becomes a contradictory place. Sometimes it remains the setting for chaste, courtly love, But equally, sometimes it turns into a backdrop for a more openly erotic and amorous adventure. Sometimes it's viewed as a welcome place of refuge and reflection, and at other times, the high walls act as a prison. But these contradictions perhaps only added to the allure of the walled garden, making it a place of romance and adventure. And by the 16th century, the English Tudor poet Stephen Hawes was still rhapsodizing about the walled garden and using it as a potent literary motif in his poem, The Pastime of Pleasure. Amidst the garden so much delectable, there was an arbour fair and quadrant, to paradise right well comparable, set all about with flowers fragrant. Delectable as they may have been in literature, real walled gardens originally evolved as fairly practical places. Enclosed medicinal gardens, used for growing plants that could heal the sick, were frequently attached to monasteries, while other walled gardens were made for the utilitarian purpose of growing food. Walls were a sensible way of segregating different sections of garden, such as the herb garden, the kitchen garden, and the orchard, and keeping them organised and tidy. However, high walls were also useful for keeping the cold British weather at bay, because they could provide shelter to more delicate plants that would not have otherwise survived through winter winds and chilly frosts. What began as a practical gardening procedure gradually developed into a more fashionable habit, as the romantic literary associations of walled gardens took hold, and 15th and 16th century landowners took to adding ornamental gardens to their walled schemes. Elizabethan knot gardens, parterres and flower gardens that were closed off by walls became popular with ladies who wished to take their exercise unobserved, and soon no smart country house was complete without a walled garden. This fashion changed dramatically during the 17th and 18th centuries, when the trend for natural landscape gardening took over, and walls were pulled down to make way for artificial lakes and sweeping rural vistas. Walled gardens were dismissed as old-fashioned and primitive, and sadly, many Tudor and Jacobean schemes were lost. However, a revival took place during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the charm of walled gardens was rediscovered by Victorian and Edwardian gardeners, and some historic gardens were reclaimed and restored, while other new designs were created. Once again, it was a work of literature that helped to renew enthusiasm for walled gardens, only this time it was a children's novel rather than a medieval poem that captured the imagination. In 1911, the novelist Frances Hodgson Burnett published her classic story, The Secret Garden, which tells the tale of a sullen and lonely little girl called Mary Lennox, who finds a mysterious, locked garden in the grounds of a gloomy Yorkshire house, and secretly begins to restore it. As the garden grows, so does she, and her world blossoms with friendship, hope, and meaning, as the gentle lessons of caring for the garden also teach her to care for others and for herself. This story has delighted and enthralled generations of children, and to this day it remains one of my favourite books. When Mary first finds the garden, it's a wild, neglected tangle, yet few readers can resist the appeal of the author's dreamy description. It was the sweetest, most mysterious-looking place anyone could imagine. The high walls, which shut it in, were covered with the leafless stems of climbing roses, which were so thick that they were matted together. There were numbers of standard roses, which had so spread their branches that they were like little trees. There were other trees in the garden, And one of the things that made the place look strangest and loveliest was that climbing roses had run all over them and swung down long tendrils, which made light swaying curtains. And here and there they had caught at each other or at a far-reaching branch, and had crept from one tree to another and made lovely bridges of themselves. It was this hazy tangle from tree to tree which made it all look so mysterious. Mary had thought it must be different from other gardens, which had not been left all by themselves so long. And indeed, it was different from any other place she had ever seen in her life. "How still it is," she whispered. "How still." I love that passage. One of the great gifts of Frances Hodgson Burnett's story, especially for people who read it at the time when it was first published, was that it gave its readers a chance to enter into the exquisite world of a walled garden through their imaginations, even if they weren't rich or well connected enough to have access to one in real life. However, even if you've never read the book, stepping into a walled garden is still a potent and almost magical pleasure. And today, it's far easier to manage, now that so many beautiful examples are open to the public. If you want to wander in a walled garden for yourself, here are 5 examples that I think are worth exploring. Garden 1. Plas Cadnant. The hidden gardens of Plas Cadnant, in Wales, are a wonderful example of a lost garden that has been reclaimed and restored. Originally laid out at the beginning of the 19th century, the gardens were abandoned and left to grow wild during the Second World War, and they were nearly lost forever. However, fortunately, when the estate was purchased in the 1990s, its new owner, Anthony Taverner, decided to reclaim the gardens, and after a lot of hard work and commitment, the gardens are now open to the public. There are 3 in total, including a walled garden that is unusual both for its size, a full 2 acres, and its walls, which are gently curving. Inside the walls, you'll find delightful herbaceous borders, a splendid central avenue of clipped topiary pyramids, and a tranquil pool where a curved bench, flanked by obelisks, is the perfect place to sit and contemplate the joy of this lovingly restored garden. Garden 2. Newby Hall. There are several beautiful and secluded garden compartments to visit at Newby Hall in North Yorkshire, although most of them are contained by hedges rather than walls. However, the autumn garden, which is on the site of an old croquet lawn, is fully walled, and it contains a stunning array of hydrangeas, dahlias, and other late-flowering plants that light up the autumn days with colour. A central gravel pathway leads to a small round pond ornamented with an old stone urn fountain, while the mellow red brick walls beautifully contrast with the scrambling greenery that climbs over them. It's a calm and lovely space where you can linger and listen to the bees humming and the birds singing. A sweet and peaceful garden of delights. Garden 3. Broughton Castle. The ladies' garden at Broughton Castle in Oxfordshire is laid out as a formal parterre, which means it has symmetrical beds that are bordered with hedging and intersected with paths. The parterre pattern is made up of both circular and fleur-de-lis shaped beds, which create a striking design, and the central roundel contains a pleasing miniature chamomile lawn. The enclosing walls of the garden are lined with herbaceous and shrub borders, and there's a profusion of roses, which fill the air with scent during the summer months and make the ladies' garden bewitchingly romantic. The scheme was created in the 1890s by Blanche, Lady Algernon Gordon Lennox, who was a leader of fashion in high society, and who was known as the best-dressed woman in England. Lady Blanche was also, however, an early breeder of Pekingese dogs, and sitting on a bench among the roses in the ladies' garden, it's easy to imagine her strolling along its gravel paths, with a fluffy little dog or two in attendance. Garden 4. Raby Castle. At Raby Castle in County Durham, the walls of the walled garden are definitely more than ornamental. Constructed out of handmade bricks that were made locally, the walls contain integrated chimney flues, which meant that they could be artificially heated during the winter. This allowed the gardeners at Raby to grow delicate, subtropical fruits in the walled garden that otherwise would never have stood the bitter temperatures of a northeast English winter. One of the plants that benefited from this ingenious system was a white Ischia fig that was planted in 1786 and still survives today. Another remarkable aspect of the Raby walled garden is that it was designed by an astronomer, Thomas Wright, a noted 18th century stargazer and mathematician who was the first person to describe the shape of the Milky Way, but who also liked to exercise his genius in other ways by dabbling in garden design. Garden 5. Great Maytham Hall. The walled garden at Great Maytham Hall in Kent has a special place in the hearts of literary garden lovers, because it was the place that inspired Frances Hodgson Burnett to write The Secret Garden. The author lived at the hall for 9 years, between 1898 and 1907, and while she was there, she actually discovered an abandoned walled garden that dated from 1721, but which had become completely overgrown. Just like the heroine of her story, Burnett stumbled across the garden by accident with the help of a friendly robin, who led her to a door in a wall that was concealed by rambling ivy. Once she had found her way in, the author set to work to bring the garden back to life, and during her time at Great Maytham Hall, she planted hundreds of roses in her newly discovered garden. She also used it as the perfect place to work on her novel, often taking a table and chair into her secret garden so that she could write there. Sadly, her roses were all dug up in the 1940s and replaced with beds of cabbages and leeks as part of the Dig for Victory campaign that encouraged people to grow their own vegetables during World War II. However, recent attempts have been made to restore the garden, and although Great Maytham Hall is now divided up into privately owned flats, the walled garden is open for visitors on a couple of days a week during the summer, so that you can step into the original secret garden for yourself. That brings us to the end of our talk about walled gardens, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to it. As always, it's been a pleasure to share this lovely topic with you, and I hope that you can join me again soon for another softly spoken audio adventure. Until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.